you. All right. We have first participant, Emilia, Felipe, Jacob. Okay. Hello all. Welcome to the session on institutions in heterodox economics. Excuse me. Wow. We have a big audience. Let me open, not this one. Okay. Something. Okay. Everyone see this screen?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Should be presentation mode. Okay, so this is the third session of the Association for Evolutionary Economics. And the title of this session is Institutions in Heterodox Economics. We have 2 hours starting now, ending at 2:15. And keep in mind that there is our, we have to end this session right at 2:15, right? And I'm Tae-Hee, the chair of this session. Okay. We have 4 presentations today.
Tae-Hee, your screen's not showing anything. Oh, it is now. Thank you.
Okay, I think something went wrong. Okay, so we have 4 presentations in this session. We are all going to talk about institutions or institutional analysis from various heterodox perspectives. So I hope you enjoyed this session, and I'm going to start the first presentation, and then I will follow the order in the program. Lynne, Scott Carter, and Ann Davis last. So let me start my presentation. And by the way, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you will see a Q&A icon. So you can use it to post your question, and the presenters will respond to your question at the end of the session. All right. So the 20 minutes for each presenter and about 40 minutes for the Q&A session at the end. So this is my presentation, and I want to start with a brief mention about John Henry, because this session was initially, when I was organizing this session, I was thinking of his recent contribution to the Routledge Handbook of Heterodox Economics, and he wrote an excellent chapter about the society and its institutions. So this session was inspired by his work, and also my presentation was inspired by his work with regard to the institutional analysis incorporating various heterodox contributions. So let me quote John Henry, because it becomes the basis of my presentation. Society incontrovertibly necessitates various arrangements or organizations in order to function or even exist. And such arrangement requires supporting concept to allow sufficient cohesion among participants, or this would dissolve in some anarchical fashion. Such arrangements and organizations are institutions. The reason I'm quoting John Henry is that we institutionalists tend to follow Veblen's definition of institutions, that is, the settled habits of thought. So we all know about how Veblen defined institutions, but personally, I don't find this definition easy to understand. When I talk to students in my class, I don't use this definition because they are not going to understand what the habits of thought mean. And also, institutionalists have talked about the meanings of institutions a lot. And we know that it is very hard to define the institutions in a very simple and straightforward manner. So I rely on John Henry's definition here. So social arrangement and organizations. As institutions, I think it is much easier to understand what institutions mean, and in particular, when it comes to the theoretical analysis of institutions and other issues that I'm going to talk about. And also another point John Henry made in his contribution is that is about heterodox economics in general. Heterodoxy is not just some reaction to neoclassicism. It is a theoretical position or positions buttressed by historical fact that attempt to explain institutions on their own social foundations. What he meant is that heterodox economics is not simply about criticizing or rejecting mainstream economics. Heterodox economics has its own research agenda, and it has uh, contributed to economics in general. So, and also I find that the younger heterodox economists view heterodox economics quite different from how the older heterodox economists view heterodox economics, but that's another issue. But I think that we have to uh, look at the heterodox economics in a positive and forward-looking manner. This is kind of the basis of my presentation. So from my own understanding, heterodox economics is a study of, first, the social provisioning process. And it is also the study of the social positioning of people and the accumulation of capital and power and the reproduction and evolution of society. This is my understanding of heterodox economics, and heterodox economics basically concerned about those issues. Of course, you can have different view about heterodox economics, but this is how I see it. So as a study of these social processes, heterodox economics must examine social institutions. Therefore, heterodox economics is, inter alia, an analysis of social institutions. This is my argument. So in order to support my argument, I'm going to review briefly core theories of heterodox economics. Again, this is my own viewpoint. So I think that there are 4 core theories in heterodox economics. I'm not just talking about institutional economics here. I'm talking about the Marxian, post-Keynesian, social, and feminist, and Sraffian economics altogether. So from my viewpoint, I think that first, the core theory is the theory of the monetary theory of production and the theory of circular production, the surplus approach, and the theory of effective demand. And taken together, those theories explain capitalist institutions which enable the production and distribution of the surplus in the monetary and circular production economy through effective demand. So they unfold the social institutional foundations of a capitalist economy. I think this is a very important position because it contrasts to the mainstream position that is asocial and anti-institutional, which is also this is a quote from John Henry. Those anti-institutional, asocial mainstream theories present the society as the natural or rational form of organization, which in one form or another existed universally. So we can clearly see a big difference between mainstream economics and heterodox economics in terms of the way that institutions are treated and analyzed. Now, then let me briefly go over those four theories, and then I will find some implications with regard to the institutional analysis in heterodox economics. And how much time do I have? About 10 minutes, I believe. So this is the circuit of capital. And we all know that the circuit of capital, following Marx, they illustrate the capitalist mode of production and the social relations of monetary production economy. And also we know that this circuit clearly shows the dominance of money-making activities over goods-making activities. And this fact is radically different from the previous systems now. And also this, the monetary theory of production shows the inherent conflict of interest between classes or between vested interest and the underlying population using the institutionalist language, legitimating the uneven distribution or perpetuation of wealth and power. So this monetary theory of production reflects social changes. For example, technical development, the institutionalization of private property, the emergence and dominance of the capitalist class and the state money, and the business corporations and the market. Now, at the center of the circuit of capital is the circular production, which means that an array of commodity capital combined with an array of labor power given capital stock leads to an array of goods and services, commodity capital. So production in this context is a circular, cumulative, social, technological process in which all resources are produced within the system. This can be illustrated by the Lynne Sraffa input-output system. And also it clearly shows the production requires social arrangement and organizations, in particular, all going concern organizations such as the business enterprises, households, and the state are mutually dependent through technical, income, and production relations. And also we can say that the viability or the production of the capitalist system rests with the social architecture of the whole system, of which the circular production is part. And this is from a Sraffian economist, Tae-Hee. Now, classical political economists and Sraffians have developed the surplus approach. And firstly, the meaning of the surplus here, the difference between the produced commodities and the original commodity capital. We can call it the surplus, but of course there are different definitions of the surplus. But if you look at this surplus approach, especially in the classical and Sraffian tradition carefully, we know that the main question here is the production and distribution of the surplus. Given technology, given social classes, a real wage rate, and the total social product. At the same time, the classical political economists, Ricardo, Marx, and most Sraffians argue that the actual distribution and the use of surplus is regulated by institutions. For example, not necessarily conspicuous consumption, state expenditures for warfare and welfare. It's all institutional matters. So institutions do matter, but here is my critique and also institutionalist critique of the classical and Sraffian surplus approach. They are assumed rather than explained. So here is my point. If heterodox economics is ultimately an institutional analysis, as Sraffians themselves argue, the examination of how the assumed givens are determined by institutions should be part of the surplus approach. This is my argument. And also, there is a surplus approach developed by institutionalist scholars, starting with Thorstein Veblen. So from this tradition, we can clearly see how the surplus is produced and distributed within the system, starting with the joint stock of community knowledge and technology, which the create or reproduce resources. And then it leads to production of basic and surplus goods. And the main argument made by those institutionalists and other heterodox economists is that production and distribution is possible by way of social arrangement and organizations. For example, the business enterprise and the state decision to produce, we may call it the effective demand for surplus good. This is the starting point or driving force. And then it leads to the production of intermediate basic goods, and then the production of surplus goods. Now, employment and incomes are generated in the process of production through the output employment multiplier, which is basically Keynes classically the multiplier. The point here is that the distribution of the surplus and incomes by way of setting administered, distributive, or exploitive variables, product prices, wage rate, interest rate, which reflect the ideological value and power of those who control them. There is the business enterprise and the state through predatory and coercive capitalist institutions. I think that this heterodox institutionalist surplus approach leads to the same implication that classical and Sraffian surplus approach makes. How much time do I have? About a few more minutes, I believe. So let me quickly go over the final two slides. And so the institutions are inseparable and endogenous in the production and distribution of the surplus in a monetary production economy. And then let me just point out the bullet here. As the production and distribution of the surplus is controlled by the ruling class by way of making institutions, the pace and path of capital accumulation and hence the evolution of society rests with deliberate decisions and actions of the same class represented by the business enterprise and the state. So in this statement, it's very clear about the institutions as social arrangement and social organizations driving the evolution of society. So here are some concluding the point. So heterodox economics explains the social institutional foundations of capitalism, in particular regard to provisioning, positioning, accumulation, distribution, reproduction, and evolution. Institutions should not be treated as a theoretical addendum if heterodox economics is to account for historical reality of capitalism in those terms. No single heterodox approach is enough. Heterodox economists should be open to other heterodox approaches. And finally, the analysis of institutions is a common ground among heterodox traditions from which they can build a theoretical system as an alternative to the mainstream. This is basically the argument made by John Henry in his contribution to the handbook. Thank you. Now, so now it's Lynne Chaster's turn. Then she will be talking about the institutions from the French regulation theories viewpoint.
Thanks, Tae-Hee. It's really nice to see so many names of people that are attending this session because we're not there in person. And I've got to apologise because it's the middle of the night for me, so I've got a scratchy voice. It's about 4 o'clock, 4:30 in the morning. Some of my comments that I'll make, you will have heard me make previously, but I'm weaving the narrative in a slightly different way. And it's basically been informed by previous papers that I have presented at this particular conference. Can everyone see my screen okay? Okay. I want to start focusing on these 3 short quotes. Rick Addison wrote some years ago that institutionalists incorporate and rely on ideas that cross ideological and disciplinary boundaries. Some time earlier, Phil O'Hara had written that the regulation and SSA approaches are very much in the institutionalist tradition, excuse me, and deserve to be closely examined by AFEE members. In the AFEE call for papers for the 2015 conference, it was written that institutional economics can look beyond the ideas of Keynes, Galecki, Sraffa and Marx edifice and engage with other institutionalist traditions. My argument's quite simple. I think there's limited evidence of such engagement or ideological crossings, although I will argue that the institutionalist tradition of French regulation theory does provide insights which could be usefully deployed by institutional analysis, very much informed by the original institutional economics. However, I will also argue that both heterodox traditions should conceive of institutions to account for global phenomena, neoliberalism, financialisation, globalisation, and I propose a method to do this. And why I'm suggesting this is I don't think any heterodox tradition has a hold or a privileged position in terms of how institutions are conceived. But if heterodoxy is going to have relevance to explain our contemporary reality, it has to constantly review and consider how various definitions or conceptions are applied, particularly given the changes that global phenomena have made to capitalist economies and social provisioning processes. And you've also heard me argue this before, that I think the social ontology underpinning the conceptualisation of a definition should be made quite explicit. If not, the methodological usefulness is reduced of this very important analytical construct. To outline my argument, I'm going to very briefly discuss the analytical frameworks of these 2 heterodox traditions that is informing my argument, then briefly explore the dominant conceptualisations of an institution, but primarily informed by the original institutionalists, and then draw several observations and conclusions from those comments. So to begin with, this is how I see the analytical framework of institutional economics, starting with Grucci's definition of economics as the science of social provisioning. But that definition we usually find in the discourse is pretty abstract. We see references to ongoing economic processes that provide flows. We see references to how societies organise themselves to secure necessary goods and services in order to maintain and reproduce themselves. And we see references to physical and financial flows of a continually changing culture. I find the 2011 definition by Fred Lee and Tae-Hee is much more concrete when they talk of social processes, institutions, historical time, change, evolution, culture and values that determine the organisation of social provisioning's economic activities. Because I think that more concrete definition actually foreshadows an analytical approach for empirical analysis, which Lee has articulated as having three constituent components: structure, organisation and agency. And if there's an opportunity in the discussion at the end of the presentations, I'd like to pick up on Tae-Hee's point about social provisioning and social positioning, because I don't see them as separate forms of heterodox economics analysis, but very much integrated together. And one can see social positioning within social provisioning if we use those constituent components suggested by Lee. I also find Dillard, Duggar and Rutherford provide further insights about the institutionalist approach, focusing very much on actual social processes, not formalism or optimal, searching for optimal equilibrium. Social processes constantly changing, leading to what loosely could be called disorder or crisis or ruptures, and cumulative economic, political and social inequalities. Also references to constantly evolving economic processes, meaning that any one part can only be explained in relation to the whole. So in other words, we need a holistic approach. And individuals are social beings within a cultural context, and that cultural context engenders behaviours and beliefs. And the economic system involves interrelated processes that advance or restrict social provisioning. So I would sum up the overall analytical framework of institutionalism as constantly evolving social processes, which encase the capitalist economy. That should be the object of study to explain the organisation and outcomes of social provisioning. Institutions are the focal point, given their pivotal role in structuring social interaction and social processes, and thus the functioning of the capitalist economy. Durability, continuity and change are quite critical features of institutions, which are reflected in the structure, organisation and agency of social provisioning processes. In comparison, I see the analytical framework of regulation theory in this way, that it seeks to explain the long-run phases and dimensions of economic growth in capitalist economy and the forms of economic crisis that can occur. So it's got a very different starting point than I would say from institutional economics. It's underpinned very much by a Marxian view of capitalism's mode of production, structured around conflictual and unequal social relations. The process of accumulation, of capital accumulation, it reproduces and expands capitalism, but it must ensure the maintenance and reproduction of the social relations of capitalism, otherwise economic crises will occur. So in order to reproduce those social relations, a political and legal order is required, and meaning by that, e.g. the support and maintenance of private property rights, effective financial systems, functioning labour markets, as well as certain regularities or patterns of regularities occurring. And certain core elements are sustained over time. Certain core elements within social relations. I'm not suggesting that social relations don't change over time, but certain core elements are sustained over time, while their historical form and precise articulation will continually evolve, ensuring the hegemony of capitalism. Now, those regularities actually define a regime of accumulation, which we can just commonly defined as a period of relatively stable capitalist development. Economic and social regulators ensure the reproduction of capitalist social relations and sustain accumulation. And these regularities can be explained by analysing the accumulation regime's institutional or structural forms. And this is the concrete expression of the accumulation regime, which is commonly referred to as the mode of regulation. And what does the mode do? Well, it coheres the accumulation regime through a conjunction of institutional forms. And I would stress the conjunction. It's not just a set of institutions, but those institutions form a particular conjunction. 5 institutional forms comprise the mode: monetary regime, wage labour nexus, form of competition, and international position and form of the state. What has been found through various regulation analysis is there's the ongoing metamorphosis of each institutional form. So it evolves, but it's got a core invariant element. So its representation changes over time. It's also been found that there's a hierarchy of institutional forms delineating different modes, different periods of capitalism's development. And what I mean by hierarchy is, for example, post-World War II, the wage labour nexus was much more dominant as an institutional form than it is today, where we would today probably refer more to the monetary regime and the international position as being much more dominant as institutional forms. So moving to the dominant conceptualizations of an institution, we see right across various discourses that institutions are variously referred to as rules, laws, regulations, constraints, controls, customs, norms, going concerns, collective action, behaviour patterns, conventions, arrangements, orders, modes of governance, etc., etc. But it's what has, I guess, doggedly accompanied use of this term institution is a lack of definitional clarity. And I think it was Bill Waller who actually suggested that this possibly derives from Veblen's and Hamilton's early conceptualizations of institutions. Tae-Hee referred to, he doesn't use Veblen's reference to sort of prevalent habits of thought. I actually do use this one with my students to help them understand how institutions are not just concrete, tangible representations. So prevalence, habit of thought with respect to particular relations and particular functions of the individual and community, or the nature of a usage that has become axiomatic and indispensable by habituation and general acceptance. That might seem abstract and vague, but I think the more you read and reflect on that definition, you can see where Veblen was going. Hamilton, I read as arguing quite strongly for the need to understand the function of institutions to set a pattern of behaviour and to fix a zone of tolerance for an activity in order to explain the changing nature of culture. Commons and Ayres were also concerned with functionality of institutions. Commons, an institution is seen as collective action in control of individuals, and for Ayres, about patterns of functional social activity structured around subdivisions of the social whole. Behavioural functionality is also evident in Lawson's notion of institutions as forms of emergent social phenomena, social systems or structured processes of interaction. And Dekesh's categorisation of institutions as impacting behaviour through constraints providing information and influencing the ends pursued by people. I feel in contrast that Hodgson's definition or rules-based definition of an institution, it actually subordinates that behavioural functionality that really comes to the fore through the ones that I've mentioned in terms of Commons, Ayres, Veblen, Hamilton, Lawson, etc. And I also think the rules-based definition, it echoes those that have been advocated by the mainstream, and I'm thinking here in terms of Ostrom and particularly North. And I think once we focus just on a rules-based definition, we actually lose the social phenomena of which institutions are. So just some observations and concluding comments. How am I going for time, Tae-Hee? Okay. Both heterodox traditions envisage institutions as evolving elements, critical to explaining social processes, relations and structure of the socially encased capitalist economy. I think though, French regulation theory also provides insights about institutional complementarity, conjunction, configuration, hierarchy and metamorphosis, which could be deployed by institutional analyses, and I don't see those elements, those insights necessarily prevalent, and I think they could be adopted much more. I also feel that it's perhaps the Marxian underpinnings of regulation theory that has acted as a deterrent to using those particular insights, despite Grucci's claim that Marx was the originator of institutional economics. I think the references by Alan Grucci and Bill Duggar to flows within the social provisioning process were very precedent decades ago. Financialisation and globalisation are flows transcending national geographic boundaries. But I think because of the influence of those global flows, that reinforces the need for a conceptualisation of institutions to not be limited by national economic organisation. And I do find with the regulationists and a lot of institutional analysis, it's very much macro bound. I think it's very easy to deploy a set of analytical questions for this purpose, and I've just given some examples there to reveal the financialisation of one institutional form of regulation analysis, the wage labour nexus. And finally, the delineation or conceptualisation of institution will reflect its methodological purpose, which in turn reflects epistemological and ontological views. And I think, as probably many of you have heard me argue before, the ontological presuppositions informing analytical constructs should be made explicit for empirical analysis, because the conception of institution needs to cohere with the analyst's social ontology, in other words, view of social reality. If not, the methodology, the use of the analytical construct will be inappropriate for its purpose. Ontological presuppositions of analytical frameworks are rarely rendered explicit, but rules, customs, norms, conventions, or patterns of behaviour do not tell us more than that. An institution is more than social rules, and that's why I come back to saying I'm uncomfortable with the rules-based definition. An institution is more than social rules, it is a social phenomenon. And if social inquiry is to explain reality, an institution's ontological presuppositions should be made explicit to provide a cogent articulation of the context and outcomes of social inquiry and the policy prescriptions arising. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynne. It was an excellent presentation. And I think we got one question so far. So let me just remind the attendee, the participant that you can ask a question to presenters by using the Q&A button below, right? And then we will get back to those questions at the end of the session. So Our next presenter is Scott Carter from University of Tulsa, and has a very interesting title here, Exploring the Kernels of Institutionalist Thought in Sraffa's Economic Theory and Archival Material. Okay, Scott.
Okay, great. Hi, thank you. Can you hear?
Yep.
People, are people following me? Hello?
Okay, it's good now.
People to hear me?
Yeah, it's all good.
You can't hear me, right? Okay, great. I'm going to share. Okay. Hello? Is it not? It says my internet connection is unstable, so I don't know if you can hear me or not. Let me do this here. I'm going to share I have a Google Doc, and I'm going to share it in the comment section where you can get the link. Okay, I assume people can hear me, right? You can get the link. I don't know if they've turned the comments on or not. So I'm going to go ahead and share it. And so you can get the link here. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, what I want to do is desktop 2. There it is. Share that. Okay, and yes, I do got it. People are on it. Okay, and let me come here. All right. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I am an interloper. I'm not an institutional economist. I have a lot of respect for the discipline and the perspective that's given here. I learn a lot every time I attend these sessions, and I want to thank Tae-Hee for bringing me into this and inviting me for this. And I also want to shout out to John Henry. I think it's important, his contributions, and we certainly are at a loss. So God bless him and his family. What I'd like to do here today is I'd like to speak about Sraffa, not Sraffian, okay? Not Sraffian economics, but Sraffa's archival material, okay? In fact, I don't consider myself a Sraffian. I consider myself more of a Marxist, and I've seen people refer to me as a neo-Marxist because I incorporate some of the new solution interpretation of the determination of the value of labor power, specifically referenced on the share approach versus the bundle approach to the value of labor power. And I got that from Sraffa, at least my archival, my reading of Sraffa. But what I'd like to do here today is I would like to present to the readers. You're going to see that the document's long, okay? Basically, I just went through the material in preparation for this. This is just a very preliminary, so apologies for the preliminary character of this, to have people go through and explore for themselves Sraffa's archival material. So I'm speaking to the young people here, to the young economists here who are looking for new directions from which they can take their institutionalism and their theoretical work generally. Sraffa's archival material are a gold mine. Okay, they have been basically virgin territory for 35 years. Very few people have had access to them, and who has had access to them has not had them in a digital format, etc. And now what we have with the archival material now online, we're able to uncover and understand some of the material that's there. Now, the way that it appears on the Wren Library website, all the images are there. They're very nice, but it's as if you were to walk right into the University of Cambridge of Trinity College Wren Library and then go and sit down and get the material there. In other words, it's not organized, it's not transcribed, it's not indexed, nothing like that. So what I've done here, and I'm gonna cut to the chase, which is gonna go through the archival material, is I present the two different web portals from which we can begin to understand the archival material, where it exists, so to speak. The first one I call here A is going to be the Wren Trinity Janus portal. Those are just images that I put on there. You can't click on any of those. Okay, here you'll see the, and this might be review for some people, but I think it's important for everyone to understand exactly where we are in this moment. Let me just step back and say this. for the first time in the history of economic thought, we now have access to Sraffa's archival material that is completely unfettered, uninterpreted, and I think that's incredibly important for younger generations of economists, because no one wants someone to interpret things for them. They want to read the original material themselves so that it can blossom and so that the science can move forward. But in any event, so we have here, all this is from the Wren Library. Okay, we're going to be focusing here on D, all right? And on D, you're going to have here, D, these are going to be the 3 different levels of archival material in D. D1 is notes, D2 is lectures, D3 is publications. We're going to be focusing more on D3 publications. There is going to be a reference to advanced theory of all of 1920, and I'm going to talk about that. Okay, and then those are going to be the lecture notes on the advanced theory of value. Okay, these are going to be the D312. Okay, where D312 is going to be the material that's going to be related to Sraffa's archive for notes of production of commodities. I've highlighted the first 13 files there because those first 13 files are going to be the material that Sraffa had written from 1927 to 1932. I have that completely transcribed. I have that completely, and I'm working on an index, but it's in Google Docs, it's in Google Slides, all that is transcribed. And what I'm doing for this presentation today, in terms of how do we explore institutional thinking in Sraffa's own approach, is I did some simple searches from that collection of the material. I don't have the remainder, which is 115 files in total. I don't have that yet finished. This is an ongoing endeavor. Okay, this is going to be the totality of the material in D312, 115 files. You can see this blue area there, 1927 to 1931. That's the material that's transcribed, that's archived, that's put in Google Docs and Google Slides, that is basically navigatable for scholars to explore for themselves. Okay, then you're going to have the material from the 1940s. That's going to be in green. It shouldn't be 2731 there. That should say 1940 to 1946. And then the major material is going to be in 1955 to 1960. I'm going to focus mostly today on the material from 1927 to 1931. I introduced my website. I don't mean to do a plug, but this is where it is. It's sraffaarchive.org. That's going to be my plug. It's not a lot to it. A blog, which I haven't done a lot of blog posting lately, but the latter one here, the Trinity 2.0 arrangement, that is going to be the arrangement wherein we see the material. And that's going to be right there. And so what I've done is I've broken the material out. I had to take the material, I had to take those 13 Wren Trinity files and I had to put them in chronological order. It turns out, lo and behold, the material as it's arranged on the Wren Library is not in chronological order. It requires an arrangement. What you see at the Wren Library is a catalog. A catalog is able to ascertain precisely what the particular reference for an archive document is. An arrangement understands how we can appropriate the content. I like to think that what the Trinity 2.0 arrangement does, that what I'm doing is similar to doing for Sraffa what he did for Ricardo. We know what Sraffa did with Ricardo. He worked with Ricardo's archival material, and I think that type of indexing, that type of referencing is absolutely essential as Sraffian economic theory is going to go into the 21st century and move beyond the ghetto of just being a minor subfield of the heterodoxy. I think all of economic science has to work through Sraffa's economic theory, and it's all there. I'm just going to put there, just go through. You can go on, you can click it. I'll just real quick. There are two different interfaces with respect to the Trinity 2.0 arrangement, which appears on the Sraffa, the digital Sraffa website. The Google Doc, which is a complete transcription of the material from the 1920s and the 1930s, and really the Google slide. And I think it's important to have the Google slide because the Google slide gives you pictures and images of the material that Sraffa wrote. I think it's absolutely essential to read Sraffa's own handwriting. And now the technology allows us to do that. And so that's kind of the preface, so to speak, of what we're doing. Now what I want to do is I want to come, so then I come here. These links are live. All right, you should be able to link on all of these and get all these links. You're going to have the first column are going to be the different slideshows. The second column are going to be the different transcript. This transcript, their full transcription, I think it's like 150,000 words. There are typographical errors. This is a work in progress. I put it out there in this incomplete form so that students and scholars and interested people can have access to it. It's not doing any good just sitting on my computer. Do know that 2021 is going to be the year I'm really going to try to get in here and then tighten some of that up. If comments are welcome, I need the help on getting this done, etc. The third column is going to be the Janus portal. Okay, and so I do again, this is going to be material from the 20s. Okay, I break it down by pages and by documents, everything there. This is going to be basically the entire litany of Sraffa's archival material as he wrote in the 1920s and the 1930s in chronological order. You can see a lot of it began from 1927 and 1928. Here, fall of 1928 here, that's when he begins his lecture notes on the advanced theory of value. So most of the material was done before he began his advanced theory of value, and then latter is going to be afterwards. And then here I have the breakdown. Okay, so there I have it broken down. These links are live, and so you should be able to click on them. Those are going to be the spreadsheets. I don't want that. It just be the spreadsheets that we have there, and you can see how it's broken down with fall 1928 being the demarker year between them. This is the lecture notes on the advanced theory of value. That also is completely transcribed and has all the images, and you can search that as well. So there's a lot of material for scholars to reference. Then what I do is, okay, the first thing I do, let's see, what if I take this material from 1920s and let me just search institutions. Okay, so I start searching institutions. Okay, boom. I'm sorting there. I'm sorry. I'm going to keep going. Institutions. Okay, and so what we had here in the material from the 1920s to the 1930s, the word institution came up on 4 different note set documents in the archive. Okay, key takeaways that I've gotten from this. 1, Sraffa's writing in November 1927 after the turning point. Garignani in 2005 speaks about Sraffa's turning point in November 1927. We're at that period. 2, Sraffa identifies social aggregate labor from individual quantity of labor. He distinguishes between the two. It takes him to this question about the social, about the aggregate. And in fact, he's going to define an institution as a social relation that's going to determine or going to be a function of the remunerative character of the surplus. 3, the aggregate social labor is going to be natural as opposed to institutional. Institutional is going to be the way in which it's going to express itself, which is going to be 4, the distributive nature of the revenue is going to be institutional. 5 is going to reference the civil code. 6 is going to be the notion of inducement. 7 is going to be the idea of how can things accrue a revenue stream, and then 8 is going to be the continuation into the 1950s. I know I'm just going through there, but I wanted to show you the actual content. This is it. So this is going to be the first document that's going to have Sraffa's writing the word institutions. Now, I'm not an institutional economist, so I'm just searching for the word. I leave it for you experts to determine how the you determine how this fits in to the particular definitions, and to give you the material to get out there and then make it and to make it happen. Okay, this particular document is called Labor Cost and Interest. I'm going to just read real quickly through this here. Okay, labor cost and interest. Here, he writes this in November of 1927. Sraffa's coming to the realization of the distribution of the revenue. He comes here, he says the whole process of production must be called human labor. This is all the products and all the different values. Marx and Ricardo use labor in 2 different senses, the above, i.e. the aggregate whole process, as well as the notion of the different quantities of labor. he says that there is confusion in Ricardo and Marx by confusing the two different sorts of labor. And then he argues that that's the former social sort of labor, which is going to be important. And then this is where he gets institutions going to be the highlighted here, okay? That second paragraph there. It is, of course, human labor in the first sense, in the aggregate, that goes on every day in factories and workshops and fields and mines and ships and produces everything. No one has ever met, quote unquote, waiting there. Now, Sraffa, let me just finish it. Nobody has met, quote, waiting there, i.e. in the natural form of labor. A waiting is purely institutional. Labor is natural. And he's quoting them. He's putting the quotation in each. Now, when Sraffa refers to waiting here, he's not talking about waiting. How does that of waiting allow for physical means of production to accrue a revenue stream? What is it about capital that allows this physical magnitude, this objectively physical quantity to accrue a revenue stream? And according to Sraffa, where I'm arguing here, is that he sees that as institutional. And this is where he brings in the concept of the civil code. The civil code gives certain people the right to destroy the factories and machines. So they are enabled to charge a price for the grace of postponing the destruction. This is going to be a theme that Sraffa is going to bring throughout his archive and even going into the material into the 1940s and the 1950s. And that has to do with the ability, it's almost like I see it as an extortion. Right? And here we are living in the United States, and we're seeing how this extortion is expressing itself on a daily basis in terms of this president, et cetera. And I heard on Al Jazeera how water markets are now being advanced. And again, the idea that we're going to take the ownership of this particular asset and we're going to leverage that in order to accrue that revenue stream. I will screw it up if you don't pay me something in order for me not to destroy it, the grace of postponing my destruction. That I really saw a lot in the archive. Okay, I'll let you read through that. This is the second one. Okay, this is the second time that he talks about institutions. Okay, cost is means, not inducement. Okay, it is possible, the possibility to produce depends on the absolute real size of the remuneration. There is no trick possible. It is physical material necessity. Again, the trick, the postponing the consumption, I will leverage my power in order to now destroy the means of production that are privately owned because I have the opportunity to, unless you are giving me money for it. I look at that as almost an opportunity cost argument here. And Sraffa does talk about opportunity costs in the lecture notes on the advanced theory of value. And I'll go to the highlighted portion there. It is a psychological necessity only, and it can be overcome by tricks, by cheating, etc. Okay, means belong to natural economics, i.e., they are cost in the sense of means belong to natural economics. They are equal in all forms of society and are independent of institutions. Cost in the sense of inducements belongs to institutional economics. You can see Sraffa underlines as institutional economics. They vary according to social standards, examples, envy, desire for equality, a rise in social standard, etc. Slavery, wage earners, managers, politicians, artists, all have the same physical need, but require varying inducements. So here we begin to see how Sraffa is locating the difference between the natural economy and the institutional economy by focus on the latter in terms of the social structure. Okay, this is a famous. Please let me know when I'm running out because I'll run over. Okay, so please send me Scott. Yes, I agree with that. Okay, let me know when I'm going over. This is a famous archive that Antonella Picchio has spoken about when it comes to the notion of carrots. Okay, this idea efficient and final causes here. Okay, I'm reading the highlighted portion. Classical political economy dealt only with the first sort of causes, i.e. of material things that have existed in the past. Modern economics deals with the second class, hopes for the future, such as utility, abstinence, disutility, etc. These things that must be noticed refer only to thoughts foreseen of future acts. And so you have a distinction between what's objectively happening and the psychological inducements, the mechanisms that are independent of and related to, of course, but independent of the physical structure of production. Okay, and so then I'll leave this here with Picchio. It's really nice. Where she talks about the inducements of real the economy to be moved by real carrots, and neoclassical economics is going to be induced by the prospect to get some carrots in the future, and then that kind of mediates and mitigates the difference. Psychology, he starts talking about psychology. That, of course, brings us into some of the anthropological stuff that Sraffa did. So I threw a few slides here on some of the anthropological relations that Sraffa was talking about. And then here, Sraffa does refer to Marist Clark, John Marist Clark, quite a bit. This is one particular 5-page document that Sraffa writes on Clark's Economics and Modern Psychology. And there we begin to see, or we see how Sraffa was looking at the criticism that Clark was giving with respect to the marginal theory of value, also Hobson, also all those relations that were happening in the 20s at the time. There's a really interesting paper to be had there. And I put this out there for some of you who are Clark scholars to be able to perhaps go through. And then the last thing here, I got a lot of stuff, but the last, and this is Malinowski, Argonauts of the Western Pacific. Again, Sraffa talking to more of the anthropological relations, etc. Malinowski, several quotes. But what I wanted to show you here was where Sraffa writes about, here's another one in institutions. All right, institutions, legal institutions. This is his first approach of the subsistence model, chapter 1. Picchio's referenced chapter I spoke about talks about the issue of subsistence versus surplus, and this idea of the institutions are going to determine whether we're in a subsistence or a surplus producing framework there. And then what I wanted to do is probably end this. And there's another one in institutions here. He talks about the idea of the surplus and the subsistence model and locates the institutions in the subsistence model very clearly with the notion of slavery. And that's what I wanted to talk about here. We know that the most peculiar of all institutions is, of course, that of Southern slavery. And it's interesting that Sraffa has 4 different archives in this material from the 1920s where he speaks about slavery, and he speaks about it within the context of the subsistence model where there are no wages, all the means of production, all the means of consumption are going to be assumed as means of production. Basically, it allows him to get rid of the problem of wage determination. And so then we got into the slavery. And so that I give you some notes here in terms of slavery and how he moves it to the slave community. Okay. And then the last thing I leave you with here are going to be a variety of notes, because of course, when Sraffa talks about slavery, this here is this last one is going to be the surplus product. John Davis writes a lot about this. A lot of Sraffa scholars have written on this. And I just take these right from the PowerPoints. You won't be able to click on these because they're images, but it's all in the PowerPoint, in the slideshow presentation. This is a 5-page document. It's a wonderful document. I encourage people, read the original handwritten text. I really think it makes it comes out a lot further, a lot better. And then the last thing here is a paper that I'm working on. I know I'm out of time. It's going to be the choice of the wage share over the wage bundle. And so then I just go through, and there's all sorts of evidence that I pull out there. And I leave that with you to let institutional economists to see if you can make any muster out of this and hopefully get an article out. Thank you very much. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Scott. Okay. Our last presenter is Ann Davis. And it's your turn, Ann.
Well, thank you very much for excellent presentations. So Scott, I need to share screen after you.
Scott, could you
Yes.
stop sharing your screen? I mean, stop sharing your screen.
I'm trying. I'm sorry.
Okay.
All right, let me do this here. Wait, how do you stop it? Stop. I don't want to stop. Pause share. Okay, here you go. Is that better? Pause. Stop share. There it is.
Okay.
There. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, so once again, excellent presentations. So I want to thank Tae-Hee also for the invitation. So my take on institutionalists is, again, a little bit different. I want to deal with this ongoing issue of agency versus structure. And somehow in economics, agency disappears. And I'm looking for it, right? And so I think it has something to do with the way the economy is defined in objective terms, and you can hardly tell it's people. And so I want to explore that idea a little bit further. And the idea for this paper came to me during the pandemic, and everybody's saying, oh, you can't have an economy without people. And that seemed to be shocking somehow. And so that's where my title came from. It's humanity, stupid. It's not the economy. And somehow we lose track of that. The market seems to be automatic. The invisible hand goes without people. Who needs people? In fact, some economists would even not even consider the market human. And so I want to figure out where that's coming from. And so in mainstream economics, sometimes terms are considered technical, and one of those is public goods. It's simply not private goods, and private goods are, well, technical. And so it's not really about institutions or people. So what I'm trying to do in this presentation is to bring institutions back in. And so rather than technical, I would say the definition of public goods should be about the public. It should be about the public sphere and about what the public needs for self-governing human institutions. And so I want to explore the definition of public goods a bit, use some institutional history, and then try to re-enliven the economy. Okay, so public goods maybe gives us some reference to the idea that public and private is an institutional division, although it appears technical. I would argue it's really institutional. And so in ancient Greece, we had the oikos versus the polis. The oikos was the private sphere, the land owned by the patriarch, and it was private for women and slaves and children, whereas the polis was the public sphere where you had the ultimate expression of human capacities, rational deliberation and self-government. But then with the Industrial Revolutions and new forms of property, we have a new public-private divide, with the public as representative government and the private sphere as bourgeois private property. And here I'm drawing on Jürgen Habermas. And in the modern period, the private sphere was considered freedom, according to Isaiah Berlin. So here's just a table which describes the public and the private spheres. So the public is the formal executive and the citizenry, and then we have civil society in between, and the private spheres are the household and the firm. And so instead of describing public goods as simply not private, simply non-excludable, non-subtractable, I'm going to go a different direction and try to pull back the notion of the public sphere as essentially human, where we have debate and deliberation and discussion. That's the ultimate human capacity. So in contrast with this grid, which is the typical public-private divide according to Samuelson, repeated again later by Eleanor Ostrom, we have two dimensions. One, the top excludable versus non-excludable, and on the left, subtractable versus non-subtractable, and the private good is the ultimate, both excludable and subtractable, and so that private good operates the best in the market, whereas the public good is not excludable and non-subtractable, so it has to be offered by somebody else, probably not as efficiently as the private, according to the usual value system of mainstream economics. So I would like to propose a new definition of public goods based on this ancient Greece notion that the uniquely human dimensions are the capacity for debate and deliberation in self-governance. And I would like to propose that there are two aspects of the capacity for self-governance. One is that basic needs are met, let's call it autonomy, and the other that there is recognition, that we see you, you are a visible participant in the public sphere. So here's my proposed definition. So again, there's two aspects. On the top is visibility and recognition. On the left is autonomy and security. And this is what many institutionalists call provisioning. And so high on both dimensions would be the public citizen, that is empowered, legally represented or in person, and secure that basic needs are met. And so that's the ideal of the public, is the public citizen. On the other hand, we have low visibility, the private household, and low autonomy and security in the household and the firm. And institutionalists like Polanyi and Commons make note that the private sphere is a sphere of coercion. And one way coercion works is to make sure that people don't have assurance of livelihood, and they have to work to live, or else the market discipline wouldn't work so well. And so I'm contrasting the idea that the true public citizen is one that is secure and has needs met, let's say health, education, nutrition, and also recognized as able to influence the means by which we govern. And so it might be even that the institutions we discuss could be the product of deliberation of those citizens. Because after all, institutions are what people do and what they do together, the interactions. And so why have we lost sight of that? You know, we are capable of designing our own institutions, and that's what democracy should be. And so this is the way I've defined a public citizen, that is a person who's visible, vocal, who's recognized, and also secure enough to be able to contribute. So in the ancient Greek model, the realm of necessity was where people like women and children and slaves lived, but the polis was where people were secure and they didn't have to worry about meeting basic needs. And that's the element that I'm seeking to recover here. So again, this is a further discussion of how this draws on institutionalists. So J.R. Commons, C.B. McPherson, Carol Pateman write about the private sphere as the realm of coercion, in contrast to many liberals who see the private sphere as the realm of freedom. And specifically, the private sphere relies on what Pateman calls property in the person, which is a form of coercion. So the worker sells his property for a temporary time period to the employer. And during that time period, the worker has to follow orders and do what he's told. So he's essentially selling property in his or her own person. And in that act, loses control over his or her own body. And so this is common in the factory, as Commons and others mentioned. Carol Pateman says it's also true in the household, to the extent to which there is a tradition of bride purchase in various institutions and histories. But to the extent that women need to marry to make sure their own needs are met, then there's also an aspect of coercion, what she called the sexual contract in the household. And so you could argue that both private institutions have property in the person, one the factory owning the worker, at least temporarily, and one in the household where there's a contract for sexual services, whether or not there's complete voluntary contract in both spheres. So I see some institutionalists as questioning voluntary contracting, which is a key aspect of mainstream economics, that the market is totally voluntary. So I think the market is not totally voluntary, but you could make provisions so that people did not have to sell their own labor power or other aspects of property in the person in order simply to survive. And so there is another dichotomy in the literature, between positive and negative human rights. So in market economies, typically there's a preference for negative rights, which means protection of property, which is going back to the exclusion idea. You keep people out, and that's how you protect property. And somehow that's cheaper than providing for provisioning. And so positive human rights are exactly that, to provide for provisioning as a right. Again, health, education, nutrition, in order to ensure capabilities, according to Nussbaum and Sen. And so the development of capabilities requires having those necessities met. And so although many writers say negative rights is more important, kind of the trickle-down theory of the market, this approach would emphasize positive human rights so that the labor force is not motivated by the pride of hunger, to use a term from Polanyi. And so this definition of public goods would restore, the public capacity for setting our own institutions in a collective based on rational deliberation. So one other aspect of this work, if I may extend just a little bit further, this emphasis on the body as the concept of property in the person, I think also helps explain labor market segmentation and polarization. So there's a distinction between mental and manual labor. The manual worker is often lower paid, even though his body or her body is more on the line, so to speak. And another dimension is mental work. The boss, the knowledge workers, the scientists, the creative, the managers often have a higher pay, even though their working conditions are also better. So the compensation of unpleasant workplace is really the opposite of what we find in an actual labor market segmentation. So here, again, focusing on the body and whether, again, there's two different dimensions, developmental versus disciplinary on the top, and manual labor versus mental labor, the two dimensions on the left. And so you find more women and minorities in developmental nurturing and mental, where your body is actually used on the line, like daycare and nurse. And you see higher pay with authority and discipline on the bottom right, positions like CEO, which tend to be more mental and tend to be more male, white male, and to be higher paid. And so I think in the market, in economics, we implicitly devalue the body because that's the thing for sale. And those workers who must sell their bodies, we see this during the pandemic, are the ones who are most vulnerable, whereas the ones who are in positions of authority and can use mental labor, have discretion, are the highest paid and the safest, and those are the ones that can actually work from home most easily. And so I think these segmentations, mental manual, and by gender or immigrant status, these segmentations of the labor force don't represent real values. They represent ways in which the institution can reproduce itself, as many of you have mentioned. So in conclusion, my definition of public goods, I'm hoping to bring back the human. And not just that, to realize that the economy is not just, as Lynne was saying, a set of rules, but it's the way in which survival is attained or not attained. And what a basic role of government should be then is to provide necessities to assure survival so that enlightened, rational, educated people can collectively decide what institutions work best. And you might not have our typical capitalist economy, but you might instead have innovation and growth rather than inequality and stagnation. So I offer that for you to think about and appreciate any comments. Thank you again.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, so I'll take a look at some questions here. We have a couple of open questions, and let us deal with those questions first, and then we may take more questions from the audience. Here is a question to me from Ramon Garcia Fernandez. And he says, don't you believe that a theory of classes, labor production, I believe he meant labor process, exploitation and control over surplus value is one of the necessary building blocks of heterodox economics? And yes, I think so. When I was talking about those basic questions in heterodox economics, I talked about the provisioning and positioning, accumulation, and reproduction and evolution. And I think, first of all, we can talk about classes in terms of provisioning and reproduction process. And also we can talk about the labor process and the process of provisioning and reproduction and evolution. So my point is that, yes, though those issues you mentioned are essential issues we can talk about, we need to talk about them. But my point was that when we get to, let's say, the classes, class itself is an institution, and also we can have additional questions such as how class structure is maintained, how class is reproduced over time, and also whose interest, which class interest is served most in the current system of institutions. We can deal with those questions. Yes, I think that those issues are important in doing heterodox economics. And let me move on to the next question from Smita. I think it goes to Lynne, right? Do you read the question?
Yes. Is regulation theory's emphasis on crisis likely to skew its implications for a comparison with other types of institutional analysis? I don't see the regulationists have skewed their analytical work towards crisis. They've got an explanation of crises, but I don't see it as crisis theory per se. I see it as being able to explain periodization of capitalism and the reasons for crisis, and dominance of or hierarchy of particular institutional forms. So I don't think it does any emphasis on crisis skew its usefulness for other institutional analyses. John Watkins made an earlier comment about, and if I can just go on asking or suggesting that to address the sort of definitional clarity issue of what is institutions is to use illustrations, quite sort of concrete illustrations. And I think both Tae-Hee and I would have gone to that if we'd had sufficient time. The extra suggestion is that French versus UK diets of horses or snails seem to generate the same problem, but food systems are not only specific products, but standard setting, market creating, and perhaps monopolies. Food systems are framed and shaped by a whole lot of institutions, including standard settings and institutions that support markets and monopolies, etc. So I think that goes to the heart of the complexity of what we're dealing with. So we could actually have a hierarchical definition of institutions, moving from the most abstract to a much more concrete illustration of the abstract elements of those definitions. I hope that that helps answer that question.
Okay, great. And there is a question from owner, but I'm not sure who this person is. And the question is, it would seem professional athletes are the exception to the mental physical separation. And I think this is kind of comment rather than a question. I think it's to, and I believe, yeah.
I think it's
I saw it as a very challenging and interesting question, because here I'm saying people who use their bodies on the line are lower paid minority, and professional athletes are an apparent exception. You know, and certainly the professional athletes, what we watch is those bodies as they're moving across the field or down the court. And I would say that they are the exceptional bodies that are for sale. You know, so we can watch these athletes in games. We purchase tickets, we can watch them on TV. And I think there are other entertainers and actresses that have the same capacity, that there's an entertainment value, but they're still for sale. And they're kind of the promise of, if you have enough money, this is what you can buy. Whether or not it's for your personal use in direct relation or just symbolic, visual, and advertising goes the same way. That in the ads, you see beautiful people who are always very happy with their commodity. And so I think it reinforces, it's the incentive, the motivation. And so I would see it as an interesting example, but I still think it fits in the mental manual dichotomy. But thank you for the excellent question.
Thank you, Anne. Any other questions? If you wish to speak instead of typing questions, please raise your hand. I think I can allow any attendee to talk or speak. Or if you prefer, you can type any question. All right.
So I have a question for Lynne, if nobody else does.
I think someone, oh, you raised your hand?
I didn't know.
I think it was Scott.
I have a question too, but go ahead.
Yeah, Scott, go ahead. And then Anne.
Yeah. Okay, just real quick. It was my question had to do with this, what you had said, Tae-Hee, about class and about class as an institution, and it also refers to what Anne was talking about with respect to the segmented labor market. I think that I believe in class not only as an institution, but also as a way in which we can organize society. And I do believe that working class consciousness is an important element to augment. It's not, we have to actually contribute to it. And so the question then becomes, how do you get, privileged white workers, for example, to identify with the undocumented? That's precisely the point. And organizing in Chinatown, that's what we're saying. We're saying equal rights for all workers. irrespective of the documented status, irrespective of the race, et cetera, that we're trying to put the primacy on the capital labor relationship, and then there, and ergo identify as that class unity instead of having it kind of chip away at us. And so my question to both of you is, how does that labor market segmentation or that class segmentation, how do we bridge that? I guess that's the question. Thank you.
And is there a question to me and to Anne? Okay, do you want to go first, Anne?
Well, of course, it's a challenging question, but because the purpose of that diagram is to show how naturalized those divisions have become. And so mental workers just feel smarter than everybody else. And I think manual workers may have some ability to organize in common, but the gender divide, the race divide, the ethnicity, national divide, I think makes it less likely that that even the manual workers would ally. And so I would welcome your comments here. I think if we take the labor market as an institution that is designed and it isn't universal and optimal, we could say, hey, there's lots of variations on labor markets, and to kind of open up, instead of the institution being objective and outside of us, that economics, that a new institutional economics, pardon me for saying that, might bring back in the idea that this is all human made, and we need to look at how it works, and we need to say, hey, wait a minute, if we're building back new, in addition to the environment, we may want to build back in free college education. We may want to, build new elements of unity, because I think one reason why there's deflation now and decreasing labor share globally is that the institutions as they're operating have disempowered all of us, because we feel, at least I feel, that we're not really in control, and yet we're the ones who are doing it. And so how do we turn that around and make it more personal, collective, second person plural instead of third person object? So we all go to work, we're competing with each other as commodities, as commodity labor power. How do we begin to see ourselves as collectives able to redesign institutions? But I think you're right to ask the question about the labor market.
Okay, let me just briefly respond to Scott's point. Firstly, class is an institution, and also we can talk about class from a structural viewpoint. So there is a class structure, but there is a particular way of the workers and their labor is exchanged through the market, and there's an institutional aspect of class. So point is that when you talk about the class as an institution, it's not fixed. It can evolve over time. It depends upon how people actually work through the given structure. So institution is not just a structure, it's not just a rule. It involves people, it involves agency. So this is the kind of the approach that institutionalists have provided, starting with Veblen, I think. So we can have more broader the analysis of institution, I think. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, one more point on Scott's question. We can break down the divides by realizing how essential certain workers are. And so it was the low status, low paid manual workers who were the essential workers. And they're the ones that people were celebrating during the pandemic, during the lockdowns. And so I think that was a bit of a reversal. And it was temporary though. And so can we make that more permanent, that we appreciate the workers at all levels in the sense of how we contribute to some whole? It's very hard because all the so-called technical terms of the economics vocabulary prevents that.
Okay. And any other questions from the audience? Okay, the Howard Stein has a question. Is this question to all the presenters, Howard? Or any specific presenter you are thinking of?
Tae-Hee, I'm happy to make a response to Howard's comment.
Please.
Look, unfortunately, I mean, Howard, you know what it's like, 20 minutes, you can only cover so much. We were directing, I think, more our papers towards going back to this notion of institutions, but institutional analysis can really help us understand the dual threat of climate change, along with the rise of authoritarianism. And it depends how you direct your analysis to it. I mean, my set of institutions that I use with regulation theory will adequately cover the threat of climate change and what's been done. And I've written quite a bit on that. Others have written about the rise of authoritarianism. So, I mean, institutional analyses can actually tackle any issue that you really want it to. So it's not that we're ignorant of these issues, but that wasn't the purpose of any of our papers today, but we can still do it. Can I just make one other comment? There's a little bit of frustration being expressed by the attendees. ASSA has set this up as a webinar, which means only us, the presenters, can see who's actually attending the session, which is very, very unfortunate. But I can see all our familiar friends in the list of 30 odd people that have been attending this session. So even though you can't see each other, you can only see us, and you can't see the list of attendees. We know you're there. We know you're there, and we're really, really appreciative that you are there. And I know it's frustrating, and Wolfram in particular has been quite frustrated by it.
So
I hope that helps.
I'd like to take a crack at the environmental question. Again, I think the way economics framework is set out is the individual is the basic unit, and the individual kind of just pops up. And the fact that we breathe and drink water is as invisible as the fact that we associate with each other in families and friends and colleagues. The individual just kind of rules out. And I seriously propose, starting with the environment as one of the essential things, not just for clothing and shelter, but conceptualizing the earth as an ecosystem which we need to understand much better using natural science as well as social science. So I agree with that.
Okay. Well,
Could I just real quick address that on the politics question, just briefly? I do think, Howard, that it's absolutely essential. We have to have agency in our own politics. I think that, we're in a state of flux. I believe in a serious transitional period in terms of our species. And I think that we start questioning what's even democracy anymore. What do we even mean by that? I think that we have to become more engaged. We have to become more, ground up, organic. I think we have to, like I was in the chat, I'm saying, like, I consider myself a worker. I mean, it's not us or them, it's all of us. So I think that we have to be very engaged in our politics. We have to be very grassroots, and we have to be as much as possible as bottom-up democracy building as we can in order to counter the authoritarian proclivities that we see worldwide, and certainly within our nation in the next couple of weeks, that's for sure.
All right. John Watkins said something here about Anne's presentation. You want to respond to John, Anne?
So I would say that climate change is making our living conditions more difficult. And rather than just address climate change personally, I would rather incorporate the ecology into economics so that they're not two separate fields, but that when we look at, let's say, technology, that we look at the Earth's ecosystems, and that this isn't some other thing, just the job of natural scientists. I think economy needs to build in ecology in an integral way, so that it's not just when the weather is bad or when storms come, but that everything we do is informed by understanding, the Earth's cycles, that we live in a single Earth, which is a unit in spite of anything we may wish. It's a closed system. And so everything within the Earth's atmosphere affects everything else in the Earth's atmosphere. And we can no longer avoid, we can't be ignorant any longer. We have to incorporate those insights into economics. That's my view. Thank you.
Okay, I think that Olfram has a question or comment. Olfram, you can speak, but please unmute and then you can speak.
Tae-Hee, I don't think he can speak.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Oh,
yeah.
you can.
On.
Yep.
Okay. It's on Anne's previous comment and the idea that the individual, in fact, is the basic entity, even for institutionalists. Isn't there a sub-individual level for institutionalists, so to speak, the individual that is compiled in a way through its institutional fingerprint? That means from the set of social institutions, each individual, according to his or her history, personal history, adopts or adopts not an institution, a social institution. If it adopts a social institution, it adapts it in a certain way, according to its own path of experience. So I would claim that institutionalists really reject the idea that the individual is the last entity and level of analysis, but the institution is, and that is below that and above the individual at the same time.
I agree. I was using the individual as the mainstream economics foundation. I read institutionalists like Polanyi as assuming that humans are social, and I think there's much evidence for that. And so I think mainstream economics is weaker for the starting base of the individual. And I think institutionalists provide us with an understanding of how humans tend to be social, but I still think institutionalists could go further and look at the agency aspect, not just institutions and patterns as how they are reproduced, but as how we choose to act. And I think our actions are more powerful if they're collective. So I think we agree.
Okay, And actually, I allowed Wolfram to speak because I think that the chair of the session can do that. So if there is anyone who wants to speak, please raise your hand. I can allow the attendee to speak. Any other questions? Yeah, this Zoom webinar is so complicated. And one problem I have is that I cannot concentrate to speakers talking. So I have to look at this Q&A, the chat, and other things. So it's hard to concentrate from my point of view. Okay. Questions?
I think we're out of time. I think we're out of time. We're going to be cut off pretty quickly.
We have, I think, 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah. Any questions to anyone? Otherwise, we can leave a little bit early. We can take a break before the AFEE membership meeting.
I actually have a question for Lynne, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
I was interested in your ontological premises, if you could explain more about what that means.
Well, I'm really talking about a view of social reality. And I'm really talking about what the view is of the nature, character, basic features, structures, constituents of social reality. And the best way to explain it is the mainstream starts from a very narrow position of a closed system, whereas heterodoxy very much starts from open systems, endogenous, exogenous influences. So it goes to the heart of what Fred was writing about in terms of structure and agency. And it's also, unless you make your view of reality clear, you run into that problem that Lawson has written about for years. In other words, the methodology does not fit the underlying social ontology or the ontological view of how reality is structured and formed. So that's what I was really getting at, is to declare at the outset, what is your view? I mean, as part of, I guess what I explain is, when I use my regulationist approach, is it's very much underpinned by that Marxian view of capitalism structured around the mode of production and unequal social relations. That's what I mean by declaring the ontological presuppositions. And that goes to the heart of how we conceive of an institution. If we conceive of it just as a set of rules, what does that actually say in terms of our view of social reality, and how will institutions help us understand social reality if it's just conceived as a set of rules? A set of rules can mean anything. It could mean, which side of the road do you drive down? Do you respond to mandatory mask wearing during the pandemic? To something much more formal. But it needs to be located, that every institution and conception needs to be located in a view, because that view will inform how you conceive an institution. I'm not explaining this very well. It's probably because I've been awake for most of the night. I'm starting to feel a bit jet lagged, even though I'm not there with you. Does that make sense, Anne?
Okay. Any other questions from the audience? And I think we can conclude this session a little bit early. So we have a little bit longer break before the membership meeting. How about that?
Thank you, Tae-Hee. But it really is, I mean, I know it's a disadvantage, but it is really nice seeing everyone's familiar name
Yep.
on the list of attendees. It actually makes, I mean, I feel so far away. I am far away, but it actually makes me feel like I am part of the meeting. So thank you everyone for attending.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think it was an
Thank
excellent.
you very much, Tae-Hee, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.